Alright, this is a continuation of my lecture from the last week of quizzes, and we will pick up on page 590 in chapter 1. Do keep in mind this week we'll have a few more videos. That's just to keep things shorter, I guess, so you could watch one or two a day if you wanted and not feel overwhelmed with the material. So in chapter 1 we start off again in the civil rights movement, particularly talking about the I Have a Dream speech that was in 1963. You see this happening. South Vietnam, things are stagnant but extremely expensive for us, and then you have JFK that's suddenly killed. Johnson comes in. Again, he and Kennedy did not get along. I didn't mention this earlier, but this does feel very reminiscent of Roosevelt and Truman, except for that there was a large amount of animosity. There's things I've read that Kennedy basically would schedule meetings and get Johnson the time, and it would be an hour or two afterwards, so he would walk up on the meeting as everybody was leaving, and it was this big joke to Kennedy. And I don't know if that was a maturity thing, but I will tell you that he and Johnson just clashed on most everything. And so when Johnson came into office, he was in many ways in the dark. He was sworn in on Air Force One right next to Jackie, who was still covered in brain matter and blood from Kennedy's assassination. His foreign policy about Vietnam, he's a staunch anti-communist, and so he wanted to get the communists out. November 1963, we have 16,000 American non-combat advisors there in Vietnam trying to train the Vietnamese soldiers. LBJ upped that by about 5,000, hoping to do another 5,000 on top of that very soon. Summer of 64, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, you have U.S. naval destroyers coming in under attack by the North Vietnamese with torpedo boats. The reporting and the information from Johnson's office is a little sketchy. He says the attacks were unprovoked, which is going to incite the American public to want to be more involved in Vietnam. He uses this opportunity to take control. He is given the leverage to take all necessary actions or necessary measures without needing Congress's approval in this. Congress later did come to regret this. His presence in the war escalated very quickly. He started rolling thunder, and in 64, the U.S. was in full combat, mass fatalities. You have landing troops patrolling the jungles, air assaults at Hanoi and Haiphong. Total tonnage dropped, bombs dropped there in Vietnam, surpassed all of the tonnage dropped in World War II. This is a massive undertaking, and we're not just talking about the number of bombs, we're talking about the cost of the bombs, the cost of lives, the random assortment of drop. It's just crazy. Americans are confused and frustrated. This is a difficult war. I mentioned guerrilla warfare earlier. This is essentially how things are fought in this particular war. The Viet Cong used unfamiliar and untraditional tactics such as hit and run, guerrilla, blend in, AK-47 and little else. They're highly mobile, deep tunnels where they'd hide underground. The American soldiers could not tell the good from the bad guys, and this was very, very frustrating, and they'd often attach bombs to little kids and send them out to the Americans. It's just a horrific form of war that was very difficult for them. March 1968, Johnson's Secretary of Defense resigned, decided that the war was a mistake and really could not be won. Domestically, he's dealing with tax reductions, the Civil Rights Bill, war on poverty, which included an economic opportunity bill. He included kind of a Peace Corps for the homeland, which was VISTA, as well as a community action program. All of this was a part of what he called the Great Society program, which his overall theme was to end poverty and end racial injustice. This was a guy who came from a very, very humble and poor background. This is probably another part of where he and Kennedy completely clashed. Kennedy came from incredible wealth and privilege his whole life, and Johnson did not, and so he had to pull himself up. On page 596, gets back into the civil rights movement. Johnson pushed for and won the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which barred racial discrimination in public places like hotels and restaurants. It also called on the Justice Department to start very seriously and intently prosecuting schools that were not in compliance with desegregation. During this time period, we see King continuing to work for equality and winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1965. We also see a huge push in voter registration within the black communities, with 3 million new black voters in this time period. You also see the Selma to Montgomery March. If you ever come into my office, I'm pointing to something you can't see. Oh, I'll turn the camera. This is my Pride and Joy, my video, or not my video, my poster that illustrates that Freedom Walk from Selma. I have no idea if you could see that. I hope you could. But this is a huge march. Took them several attempts to finally do it, where Johnson finally sent in federal troops to protect their right to demonstrate in this way. The result was mixed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed in some ways as a direct result of that. So that's a good thing. Brought in another 250,000 black voters. You also see the Watts race riot, Black District of LA, very impoverished. With this, we see 34 people killed, 1,000 injured, 3,500 are arrested because of these, $35 million in damages in just 6 days. It's a very difficult thing. You also see the rise of black power. In that, I'm talking about a more violent movement. You've got the Black Muslims and the Black Panthers, with Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael respectively leading those groups. In Chapter 2, you have a series of terrible events. You have the My Lai event, which was a Vietnam village where 300 people were executed by William Cawley and his men, including women and children. They couldn't tell a difference. Were they good guys or bad guys? And they just killed them all. You see race riots all over the country. MLK is killed in Memphis. You see Robert Kennedy killed in LA. And you see North Koreans taking a U.S. ship called the Pueblo with men being held captive. Series of terrible, unfortunate events that plagued Johnson in his presidency. January 1968, you see the Tet Offensive come about. This is the communist movement that eventually led to the making it into Saigon. Looked like the Viet Cong had won, and more resentment in the U.S. grew. March 31st, LBJ announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Hubert Humphrey, his VP, decided to throw his hat in the ring and run against Robert Kennedy. On April 4th was when King was killed. It sparked riots in 100 cities. Black Americans, they really did freak out. This was their guy. This was the guy that was going to lead them to safety, and now he's suddenly been killed. This was very hurtful. 3,000 people were hurt, 43 deaths, 27,000 arrests. That's a lot of arrests, folks. June 6th, when Bobby Kennedy's killed by an Arab national, now you have Humphrey running as the Democrat. The Republicans nominated Nixon, who came in with a plan for peace with honor in Vietnam. The conservative Republicans nominated George Wallace. He was the Alabama governor, anti-integration, pro-segregation. He ran on the American Independent Party ticket. Nixon won narrowly. The voters wanted stability. What he talked about, the peace with honor, he was seeking to see some major changes. Nixon brought years of experience in politics. He brought with him Henry Kissinger. He's an expert on foreign relations, a historian and diplomatic genius. He begins to make some pretty obvious changes right off the bat. He brought in a draft, which was changed to a lottery. He pushed for an all-volunteer army, which didn't happen until '73. His second big change was Vietnamization. This was a concept of getting out of Vietnam by preparing those South Vietnamese soldiers to fight for themselves. And we see the third major change is a shift from Vietnam to Cambodia. There is the fear that the North Vietnamese are running into Cambodia, so we're going to bomb there. And then the fourth major change brought Nixon went to Congress, and eventually the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was repealed. Basically, this was a major blow to the presidency. His peace with honor was hard fought. It did not go quite as smoothly as had been hoped. He tried to put pressure on the North Vietnamese leaders. They basically did several walkouts, threatened of more bombing, including an atomic bomb. January 27th, 1973, we see a ceasefire immediately taking effect. March 29th, the last troops were flown out of Vietnam. 20 years of war, 8 years of our direct conflict involvement, 58,000 deaths, 300,000 hurt, and $150 billion in cost. It's unbelievable. Unfortunately, in April of that year, North Vietnam took Saigon and the U.S. could not do anything, and eventually the whole country fell. Chapter 3, starting on page 603, you have China and President Nixon. He wanted to make amends with China, who is a communist state. Kissinger went to China to try and set up a private visit, and he was invited. In the same time, Nixon's working on détente, or peace, with the Soviet Union. And in 1969, Nixon had met with the Soviets in Finland, trying to work out some sort of an arms agreement. That happened in 1972 with SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This froze the use and creation of some nuclear weapons. We also see this renewed effort to make sure that other countries don't become communist. This is called the Nixon Doctrine. In Israel, October 73, we see Yom Kippur incident where Egyptian and Syrian forces attack Israel. It's a surprise attack for Israel, but in 10 days, the Israelis had the Egyptians and the Syrians running for home. They were a force to be reckoned with. The U.S. couldn't get involved in another war, but Nixon didn't want to see this spiraling out of control, so he encouraged the Israelis to start a ceasefire. Back home, the economy on page 604, the Middle East has a direct effect on our economy. It's in the toilet. How about we say that? Nixon cannot seem to get it fixed. OPEC is causing major problems with us as they are upping fuel prices, and we can't do anything about it. You have the Watergate scandal coming about during this time. You have 5 men trying to break into the offices of the DNC in the Watergate building, and then 2 news reporters stumble upon this story and take it into the national spotlight. The head thief turned out to be a former CIA officer, as well as a member of CREEP, an unfortunate nickname, a committee to re-elect the president. Interesting, huh? We also see that the thieves were paid in a secret fund controlled by Nixon's staff. Nixon denied any involvement, and in 1973 they go to trial, and McCord began to sing like a canary, so to speak. There's a flood of other testimonies that blew this wide open and brought him into focus, Nixon into focus. The trial we see kind of turning into quite the scandalous event. Do make sure and read this. It is very fascinating, I think, and hopefully you'll enjoy that information. Beyond that, he does finally announce his resignation on April 8th, bringing the country to a close of a pretty difficult era. Vietnam, as well as the Watergate scandal, where Americans are suddenly brought into queue of maybe our president isn't perfect, and there's certainly some fear in that. You also see a change again in culture. You have the hippies, known for their protests of the war, their distrust of authority figures, their outlandish behavior, as well as their connection to the drug culture and something called LSD. Music was their key to expression. Well, that and drugs probably, but your book does highlight music. You've got the Woodstock Musical Festival in 1969 in upstate New York. Joe Cocker, Jimi Hendrix, Grateful Dead, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Jefferson Airplane, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, just to name a few. Open drug use, open sexuality, free expression, no limits. It was apparently a wild party. I'll pick up with Chapter 4 in just a little bit.